Norport Miracle. The first, and for some time the only sign that the apocalypse had occurred, came in the form of a sharp tremors that caused the city of Norport to shake for about 10 seconds. Joe Malakis was sitting at his table, going over his papers, but he dropped the latest reports from his factory at the first tremor, stood up, and opened the door. "What's happening?" he asked his personal guard, who was standing at parade rest in the corridor. "I don't know, Counselor. I thought it was an explosion at first, but go find out." It didn't feel like an explosion, unless it had been a major industrial accident. That would probably be very bad, as Joel had shares in a lot of industries in Norport. It would undoubtedly be terrible for the town as a whole, and what was bad for the city was bad for Joel. When the guard came back a few minutes later and reported it was only a weak earthquake, Joel felt relieved. "Was there an eruption?" he asked. The windows of his office faced the sea, not the giant volcano that loomed over the town. "No, sir. Although the mountain is smoking a lot more than usual, we can expect heavy ashfall later." "All right, resume your post." There had been only a few recorded major eruptions of the mountain in the history of Norport, and the city had always been fortunate enough to escape almost unscathed, but it used to be much smaller in those days. A major eruption, an earthquake, could easily destroy everything Joe had managed to gain in the last few years of so-called interesting times. Other councillors and old residents complained about how the war had broken everything, just as their fathers and grandfathers had grumbled after a rich source of oil had been found in the swamps east of the town, and brought modern industry to a small fishing town. For most of its history, Norport had been small and unimportant, far from everything, special only because of the clouds of the black ash that had given its original name, Puerto Noir. The old-timers cherished the calm and usually lazy way of life in Norport, while other worlds grew, fought each other, and were destroyed by their competitors. Norport managed to avoid all that because it was a small town surviving mostly on fishing, limited coal mining, and for those few who preferred an adventurous and short life, hunting the huge dinosaurs infesting the giant swamps that made up most of the continent. But where others grumbled, Joe, his father, and his grandfather before him had thrived on the change and growth it brought. The other councillors laughed when a wealthy old-worlder industrialist asked them for permission to start drilling for oil in the swamp. They laughed, took the money offered, and expected that a giant monster of the swamps would sooner or later chase the stupid old-worlder away. Not Joe's grandfather. He sensed an opportunity even before the outwarders demonstrated their weapons to him. True, the giant beasts of the swamps didn't like the idea of industrialization much, probably even less than the city councillors did. Or in the case of giant herbivores, they were too stupid to understand what was happening. But even those were stopped by the cannons and machine guns protecting the oil drill. And it would have been a waste to just let all that meat and hide rot, wouldn't it? Joe's grandfather struck a deal with the old orders and got quite rich in the process. Rich enough to buy into the oil drilling and oil processing business. He sealed the alliance by arranging a marriage between his eldest son and the old warder's daughter. The old-timers grumbled. It took some time, but the Malakis family's growing wealth forced even the most conservative of them to accept the change and adapt to new times. Norport was still small and unimportant in the grand scheme of things, but it became a minor provider of oil to nearby worlds, and slowly but steadily grew. Until another sudden change occurred. The war. A horror for those directly affected by it. An annoyance for the other councillors and residents of the town, including the families of former foreigners who were now citizens of Norport, and had adopted much of its calm and lazy ways. But for Joel, it was a great opportunity, although it required an insane amount of effort to stay on top of things. He finished the latest report and realized that for the first time in at least a month, he didn't have anything time critical to deal with. It felt weird. But it made sense. The last week had been surprisingly uneventful. A calm before the storm, maybe. For a moment, Joe thought he might have a chance to spend some time working on his long-term goals, or maybe even have a free evening with his wife and family. There was a knock on his door, followed by a careful, "Sir, do you have a moment?" Joe turned to his secretary and masked his annoyance. "Yes, what is it?" "Sir, some strange rumors are going around. The magic people say that something horrible happened." Joe frowned. He welcomed change, but the magic people, as they were called by the old residents, were nothing but a huge annoyance. "They tend to predict catastrophe every time I talk with them. What is it this time? Are they talking about the apocalypse again, the shattering of the worlds, just because we had a minor earthquake?" "Well, it's not just them, sir. The rumors are running wild, but the Commodore's aide just called me and asked if we know anything at all. He said that something weird had happened, but they're not sure what." Joel wanted to sigh, but he was always careful to present himself as a leader with a positive outlook, even to his servants. The can-do attitude, as Alliance officers called it. "Ask around then, see if you can track down any reasonable rumors. Call the science people, they might know something. And please call the Commodore's aide back and ask him if he has any additional information." Joe thought for a moment and then added, "Tell him to send the Commodore my regards, and ask him if he will be free for a drink later. I can send my car to the port for him." "Yes, sir." Magic. Joel didn't believe much in it. For Norport inhabitants, it was mostly just weird stories from old mythical times. Simple tricks with limited practical use, despite the claims of the old worlders. There were a lot of people among the refugees who took magic for granted. Some even claimed to have talents, but they looked more like frauds and charlatans to Joel. He had asked them several times to show him some real magic, and all he had got were simple and useless tricks or excuses. If magic were real and powerful, Joel would embrace it, just as he had embraced technology, which had brought him money, and money brought him power. Power was what mattered. "The metaphysical reality of this world is exceptionally strong and stable," an elderly scientist from one of the first groups of refugees tried to explain to Joel. "And the ash clouds and shade from the geologically improbable volcano range tend to block a lot of moonlight, further reducing the magical aura of this town. It's very hard to do anything unnatural around here. The local reality doesn't like it." "So you're saying that magic is useless here?" "Impossible. That's why we have no magicians or magic," asked Joel. "I didn't say that. It's just more harder to do anything. Various minor talents are actually quite common, but anyone who's used to everyday magic will hate it here and move away. I have personally been to dozens of worlds, Counselor. This is the world with lowest magic level I've ever seen or even heard of. I like it here," said the old scientist with a smile. He soon became the lead engineer in one of Joel's new factories. The war brought so many opportunities, and Joel did his best to use as many as he could. Technically, each of the 12 counselors were equal, but some were more equal than others. Joel knew that some people talked about him as the first counselor. He always made a scene when someone said that in his presence. He insisted that this was not how the town should work, but it felt great. He allowed himself a brief moment of daydreaming. Norport used to be small and unimportant, but thanks to the war, it had grown rapidly. One day it might become the biggest city-state in all the worlds. All it needed was a few more opportunities, and a leader who wasn't afraid to take a little risk. 3 Allied naval officers arrived about an hour later. Joe greeted them in his office and poured them heavily spiced rum made by his small distillery. He personally detested this style, but knew that the sailors cherished it. They all wore the uniforms of their old navies. The Alliance had never had the time or resources to unify those, and most of the members expected to go back to their own business as soon as the war ended. It was still strange to see them as allies, even 2 years after the founding of the Alliance of the Worlds. The Commodore, the senior officer stationed in Norport, was from Canaharan Navy. His aide firm was Calon, a small archipelago nation that had been Canhara's enemy at first, then an ally. And Captain Wungsborn still probably wore his Reich's uniform, although the Reich, the arch enemy of most of the factions at the start of the war, no longer existed. In some ways, it had been much easier to work with them when they were all enemies. When the war was just a large-scale clash of several worlds and empires that had ended up in a three-sided war, with some of the small players moving between larger factions almost at will. The early stages of the war were waged almost entirely at sea, and diesel fuel became a scarce resource, quickly raising Norport's importance to levels that no one in town, except Joel, had expected. Norport declared strict neutrality as a port open to all as soon as the war started. The city resisted every attempt to become part one of the factions, selling oil, diesel, and food to any ship that entered the harbor. It was a time of many great opportunities for Joel. For one, he managed to force the city council to agree on a huge expansion of the small town guard. It was needed, he explained, to maintain safety in the port, with all those foreign soldiers constantly fighting among themselves. Most of the guard officers saw Joel as their boss, the only one who cared and paid a lot of money out of his own pocket for the maintenance, while the others councillors chaffed, argued, moaned, and hoped that the war and all those stupid outwarders would just leave them alone. When the first refugees from war-torn worlds started to arrive, attracted by the neutrality and relative safety of the Norport, it was Joel who did his best to help them, providing them with at least simple shelters and work in his quickly growing factories and other enterprises. He was careful enough to convince a few other families to follow in his footsteps by appealing to their greed. He didn't want to gain too much power too quickly, as he was already playing a very complicated political game. They're pathetically grateful and willing to work for peanuts. You're stupid if you don't use this opportunity. We either use them as a workforce, or they'll become a burden around our necks, he explained. He used the same careful manipulation on Oldwater officers and envoys. Norport is neutral, he said. Our people are not willing to join anyone. They would revolt if one of us councillors even suggested that. Your offer to build a huge refinery is generous, but that would require us to join you, and we would become targets for Reich's submarine raids. How about we just build a refinery ourselves, with your entrepreneurs as investors? What helped him most in the long term was his honesty. I'm doing it for my home, he said. Like my colleagues, I would prefer you all to go away. But I realize that it's not going to happen, so I'm doing my best to keep Norport safe. And so far that requires that we stay neutral, a safe haven for all. He gained a reputation for being a skillful and surprisingly honest diplomat. Neutral Norport gained importance as a place where talks between envoys of warring factions could occur in relative safety. Some of the wealthy people who didn't want to be involved in the war started to see Norport as a place for investment, or even the location of their businesses. When Joel got the first reports of a sudden ceasefire among all remaining factions, he felt sad. It seemed that the age of great opportunities was coming to an end. Then one of the Reich's captain discreetly told him the reason for the sudden end of hostilities. There was a new enemy, horrible, inhuman, and clearly bent on destroying everything. It was attacking on all sides and growing in numbers with each town or city conquered, and the factions couldn't afford to fight each other. They were even discussing a common alliance. Joe saw an opportunity and instantly suggested Norport as a place where the negotiations could take place. It almost backfired on him. Well, gentlemen, so far I've heard only some strange rumors, and I was hoping that you might tell me more, he said after the first drink to a group of former enemies, now fellow officers of the Alliance of the Worlds stationed in Norport, a city that had managed, barely, to remain neutral so far. We don't know anything concrete, grumbled the Commodore. But there must have been some serious event. The Grand Admiral is dead. He died a few minutes after we had that earthquake, and not just him. Several other important people died too. How can you know that, Commodore? Magic? Joe frowned. If the Alliance had a way to use radio signals across different worlds, it was a secret kept from him. Essentially, said the Commodore, a coin of favor. I had a silver one from the Grand Admiral. It disappeared. That means he must be dead. There have been a few more of them going around, from other top Alliance people. Some of the others died too. So, that huge offensive you told me about. There must have been a battle? Asked Joe carefully. He didn't know much about those coins, only that the really powerful beings were capable of creating them and gifting them to their minions. He had been shown one once, but it had looked like a simple trick. Just a silver coin appearing and disappearing at will in the hand of a drunken officer. Possibly, hissed Captain Wungsborn. We have a healer in the hospital. She used to be a priestess of entropy before the war. She rejected her god, but she had a strong seizure the moment the earthquake started. When she woke up, she claimed that she felt her god destroyed. And some of her navigators and other talented people claim that there was a huge shift in reality. Nobody knows what it means, Consular. Could I get another shot, please? Asked the Commodore. Of course. Joe poured another round, and then he said dreadfully, I don't know much about such things, gentlemen. This is probably a stupid question, but is there anything I can do to help? Well, we've come here to warn you that we're going to send 2 ships away to find out what happened. This will reduce the protection of the town below the agreed limit, so many of the councillors might grumble. I see. You really think it's time for such swift reaction? Sooner or later, another ship with refugees or tanker will surely come with news. I'm afraid we have to do this, Consular. Something bad happened. I can feel it in my bones, said the Commodore. Joe was sure that the officers were overreacting. He fully expected to see another ship in a day or two, with a new propaganda stories about glorious victories, and yet another legendary monster or hero joining the Alliance in the fight against the common enemy. Not another god, though, as he had been told that the only 2 elder gods still in existence were already supporting the fight. He generally disbelieved all such stories, and some of the officers had told him about the true state of the war. The Alliance was barely holding the invasion in check, and the genuine victories or reclamations of occupied territory were exceptionally rare. It was a situation that suited him so far because the importance of Norport slowly grew together with his personal power and reputation. And if the mysterious enemy somehow got to Norport, he had several contingency plans prepared. He would hate to use them, but he believed in being prepared. But no ship came the next day, or the day after. In old Norport, before the war, that would have been normal. It was rare for more than 1 or 2 transworld ships to enter the harbor in a week. It was odd in New Norport, a town that could now claim to be a city as its population had more than tripled in just a few years. Joe was busy moving around, squashing rumors, and being positive all around. Most of the refugees saw him as their counselor, the one who fought for their rights, attempted to persuade the rest of the council to grant them citizenship. Normally, citizenship was granted after a year of residence, but the council had voted to block that during the time of war. That had been hard to arrange for Joel, and it was becoming harder and harder to keep. He was visiting newly built residential houses close to the old port. It was shabby and quick work, made from the cheapest possible materials, but a lot better than the improvised huts where most of the refugees still lived. He praised the workers for the effort and received loud thanks, for it was he who had paid for the materials and provided the tools. A small investment, with a potentially huge return. When he was about to leave, he noticed the city guard officer running towards him. Sir, you need to go to the island right now. The big island in the bay was leased to the Alliance as a base for their warships. Joe had to scream at some of the councillors and pay huge bribes to others to get it passed. Even his allies in the council resisted. Those idiots couldn't understand that the alliance needed Norport badly enough to be willing to take it over if they didn't cooperate. If he was needed on the island, it meant that something bad must have happened. A crisis. An opportunity. What's going on? He asked calmly.
Dunno, sir. There's a ship returning. We were told to find you as soon as possible and send you to the island. Those Alliance people want you there.
Joe ordered his driver to take him to the port. He was one of the few in the city who had a personal car. It was a good reminder of his status to everyone around. Joe liked to say that it was to save time moving around the growing city, and sheepishly admit to some that this was one luxury he had decided to burn some money on because he loved modern technology. Maybe in time everyone will be wealthy enough to own a car, he said to others. Sometimes he drove himself, often faster than was safe, and he always had a huge grin plastered on his face. It worked. Common people cheered him when he drove around, while other councillors who imported their own cars were often sneered at. A waiting powerboat took him directly to the Alliance office on the island. Well, gentlemen, I was told you needed me here,
It was the apocalypse,
said the Commodore. He looked 20 years older than yesterday. I'm sorry?
The tremor. It was sign of the apocalypse.
I don't understand, Commodore. What happened?
The submarine U-57 is on her way back to the port council. She was one of the ships we sent to get information.
Already. The way between worlds usually took a few days, even for a very talented navigator. The ship had to first get far enough from shore, all the way to the ocean, and then locate the current current in the fabric of reality that would allow it to cross over to another world.
She failed to find a way out, Counselor. They lost contact with the frigate Augustus on the first attempt. Their navigator says that the currents are absolutely unstable. And he is a really good one,
said Wongsborn.
He's a sensitive. He can navigate by feel alone, even without tables and instruments. He's one of those who can find new ways. Now he says that there are none.
How is that possible?
The apocalypse,
repeated the Commodore.
That is what happened before. When the angels fought against demons, and before, when the other gods destroyed themselves, possibly even before, when the apocalypse occurs, the connections between worlds are shaken, sometimes destroyed completely.
Joe was troubled by this because for him such things were just old world legends and myths. But he vaguely remembered stories of how, in the distant past, no ships had suddenly come for several years. No one had paid any attention to it, as Norport was only a large fishing village in those times. But the first ship that came brought news of destruction and doom that nobody believed or cared about. All right, gentlemen. What is the worst case scenario for us here in Norport?
We're isolated from the rest of the worlds. Maybe for a short time we'll send U-57 to give it another try in a few days to see if the currents are stabilizing it, but it might be for a long time, maybe forever. There are stories of worlds that got cut off completely for hundreds or even thousands of years.
That sounded like great news to Joel. All right. In that case, the only big problem I see right now is food. We were dependent on imports even before the city grew so much. There's still enough in the granaries to last a few months, but if the shipping stops, well, gentlemen, in that case, we can all look forward to meals consisting mostly of dinosaur steaks and rum. One of the lower-ranking officers sneaked. That's what we're mostly fed at sea nowadays anyway. Your cans that taste like chicken and a small rum ration.
And the vitamin supplements and biscuits, we have only a limited supply of those.
said the Commodore.
But you're right, Counselor. The food will be our biggest problem in the long run if we stay isolated.
I frankly can't think of anything else that I would call critical. Except, of course, people being isolated from their loved ones, said Joel, and there's nothing we can do about that. But even in the worst case scenario, we'll survive. Or am I missing something?
Spare parts. Special equipment, ammo, gunpowder. You can't hunt those giant lizards without some serious firepower.
We can make most of this, I think, said Joel, fiercely thinking and sorting through the best opportunities life had just thrown at him. I'll go inform the council, Commodore, and I'll set some of my people to looking at ways we can get some bigger food production going. We never really bothered because it's just too hard to grow anything in the damn swamps. And we could always buy grain, but I'm sure we'll find ways to deal with it.
Well, you took it better than I thought, Counselor. But you always had that positive outlook on life,
said the Commodore.
What will others think, though? The other councillors, the city people?
I'm sorry to say this, Commodore, but I'm not sure about the refugees, except for those who already went native, as you're calling it, but most of the old-timers will be happy. I always told you that most of the city doesn't want to deal with foreigners. They might see it as the fulfillment of their wish. They'll probably celebrate until the grain runs out. As Joe predicted, most of the town took it as a good news. Joel himself was almost ecstatic, though he looked somber and patiently explained to others that hard times would be coming. It took several weeks before U-57 returned from yet another expedition, and her navigator reported that the currents were stabilizing and now that he might, maybe, with a lot of luck, try crossing over and even coming back. The commander didn't want to risk it just yet. After the next expedition over the ocean, U-57's navigator reported that the currents were calm now, although changed, some slightly, some completely, and new charts would be needed. Joel shared the enthusiasm of the Allied officers, at least publicly. Personally, he felt annoyed. Then a radio signal reported another Allied submarine had emerged from the ocean currents and was trying to call the port. It brought news, good and bad. The war was won, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. Although the forces of the mysterious enemy were annihilated, the resulting destruction was incredible. Some worlds and many Allied forces were completely destroyed. The official word from the remains of the Alliance was that the elder god Lord Entropy had sacrificed himself, and used all his power to destroy the invasion, as he saw no other way to stop them. He had summoned storms of oblivion that devoured the invaders, but also what remained of the occupied worlds. In many places, storms crossed over into other worlds and caused additional destruction, leaving terrible entropic beasts prowling the resulting apocalyptic wasteland. Joe took the first opportunity he could find to ask Captain Wungsborn what it actually meant. He had been cultivating the Reich's officers, as he had some sense for them for a long time. Wungsborn and a few others stationed in Norport already considered Joel their personal friend.
Well, Joel, I think it's way more complicated than they're telling us.
In all the stories I've heard, Entropy was always the villain. He was supposed to have caused some previous apocalypse, am I right? His redemption for his past deeds, as the Alliance calls it, seems weird. But I'm a provincial bumpkin who doesn't know much about other worlds and their history. That's why I'm asking you, Ernest.
Joel, I think they're lying, but it doesn't matter. Everyone agrees that he's kaput, and good riddance to him. But those storms, that's bad business. It's going to take years to clear out the areas where they occurred, if someone bothers at all.
Wungsborn had another ring and continued.
The other news I have from the channels we Reich officers still keep is, well, bad. For us mostly. The Alliance has already splintered. The majority of the factions still have homes they can return to. They resolved to clear their worlds and rebuild the new civilization from the ashes of the old. But there are a few like us who have nowhere to go. The Reich was willing, that started the war. After all, nobody wants us.
And I thought that you were the ones who revolted against the Reich's leadership, Ernest. Kingsborn grimaced and held out his glass for a drink. Joe poured him a generous shot of black rum. Kingsborn downed it out in one gulp and shook his head.
It doesn't matter to most of them. Now that they no longer need our submarines and our troops, all they see are former enemies, and you know that more than half of us are werewolves. Monsters.
Only by reputation, objected Joe. At least that's what he told me. Joe had been very interested in werewolves from the start. There were a few true werewolves among the outworlders working in the swamps, generally hairy and wild fellows who were supposed to be able to change their forms around the full moon. But their main strength came from the ability to heal any wounds quickly, even those that would have been fatal for a normal human. That was very useful in swamps filled with many ugly beasts. It was one of the things called magical Joe had ever seen that was at least a bit useful. He had several of the swamp wolves on his payroll as hunters and for occasional special work. But the Reich's werewolves, the war wolves, were humans who had survived a process developed by the Reich's scientists. It was supposed to turn them into super soldiers. But the most noticeable change was that it made them ugly. Stronger and more resilient than humans, the Stone Guard officers always confirmed after occasional bar fights, but mostly ugly.
Sure. Almost all of them are forced conscripts, not the original werewolf commando, but
Kingsborn shrugged.
we don't know what to do. Maybe the admiral has some plans he hasn't shared with the captains just yet, but there are enough of us to start our own colony or try to reclaim one of the Reich's original worlds, and we have almost no women. But there are too many of us to find a new home. Not if we keep our promises and stick together. Most of us just expected to fight to the bitter end anyway.
What about Norport? Asked Joe carefully. Kingsborn narrowed his eyes at him. There's no way we could support all the submarines you still have. Not now, not for some time. Some would have to be mothballed, some of the bigger ones. Those already converted for transport could easily pay for themselves as freighters, but I would love to have at least a few of the combat ones stationed here.
What for?
Interrupted Kingsborn. You know me, Ernest. Always hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. We have one small modern destroyer and two old steam-powered frigates. Norport managed to stay independent because we were far away and unimportant, but that has changed. My colleagues might think that everything will go back to normal now, but that's impossible. Sooner or later, someone might decide to come and take over. We would have problems holding off a group of determined pirates. Kingsborn snorted.
Yeah, you're essentially defenseless. When I was sent here for the first time in the early stages of the war, my report to the High Command was that it would be extremely easy to take over the town, but it would be very costly to keep it, not worth it. That's one of the reasons I recommended quietly supporting your neutrality for now.
Joe smiled at him. Good old times, he said. But now the situation has changed. I've been racking my brain ever since we had that first radio report looking for some long-term solution.
And have you talked about that with your colleagues, the councillors?
Asked Kingsborn slowly. Only with a few of them, and I've been mostly trying to get their support for building at least one new warship of our own, admitted Joe.
With all due respect, Joel, to you personally, I mean, that is your biggest long-term problem. The council. A bunch of conservative dinosaurs, every one of them claiming to be descended from the original 12 fishermen families who ended up here more than 1,000 years ago. They see anyone whose family hasn't been here for at least a few generations an annoying insect. I've heard how they talked about you just because you have an outworlder mother, Joel. I've seen how the refugees are treated outside the town, a place where we would be pirates from start. Is not a place we would want to call home, even if we could trust the leadership to be capable of doing what needs to be done.
And that's something that has to change, said Joel. I hadn't dared to force the issue before, but I'm already pushing for a repeal of the new laws against immigration. Some of the refugees will leave, but a lot of them will want to stay.
That is not enough, Joel,
Interrupted Wangsborn again.
I'm sure you'll get them citizenship eventually. And that doesn't mean that much in the end. They'll be third-class citizens at best anyway. You're lucky. No, they, the other councillors, are lucky that there hasn't been some sort of uprising already. There would be, but a lot of the refugees and previous newcomers look up to you. They believe in your promises. If those who see you as their councillor decide that you failed them.
The city is a powder keg waiting to blow, admitted Joel. The council doesn't see it that way. They just don't understand that the majority of the city is now against them. They think their personal guards and the city guard would be more than enough to put down any attempts at insurrection, but they're wrong. It would be a bloodbath, but... Joe sighed and drank his own rum. I'm dancing on a thin wire over the abyss, Ernest. If I push the council too much, they'll see it as an attempt to usurp power. My own clan isn't exactly happy with me. They stand behind me in the public, they have to, but in private. They're blaming me for using too many resources for the city and refugees. Resources that should have been used for the good of the clan, but if I don't do enough for the refugees, the worst case scenario is that they just start an insurrection and proclaim me their leader. I've been carefully offered just that by several groups, you know.
Why don't you take it, Joel? Why not become a king?
I don't want to. I prefer a political solution without any bloodbath or destruction. I could easily break the city.
And you think adding us to the mix would help?
Regarding possibly external threats, definitely. With the internal situation, if you offered your services to the city in exchange for, say, a council seat of your own, it would open the way for additional later reforms. And with you in the harbor, any possible violent scenarios might be avoided or at least limited.
Where would those reforms lead? You surely have a plan or two. I know you well enough, Joel.
I'd like to get to a republic of sorts. A representative council may be bicameral, but the actual executive power would be in the hands of one elected person. Mayor, I guess. Kungsborn nodded.
That can be a good system if you set it up well. My homeland used to be a republic for a long time, and it worked until we got unlucky with our elected president.
Really? I hadn't known that, lied Joe. They talked and drank for some time before Wongsborn excused himself. He promised Joe he would pass the message to his admiral. Weeks passed quickly, and Joel didn't get much chance to sleep or spend time with his family. He couldn't afford to, as the situation was very fluid, and some opportunities surfaced only for a moment before disappearing forever. The ship traffic was still light, and the currents of the ocean had stabilized but changed, for better or worse, depending on one's point of view. Before the apocalypse, there had been only a few solid and safe roads leading to Norport. Now, at least according to a few expeditions that U-57 had made before being sent away, there were dozens of worlds easily accessible from Norport. It was a great opportunity, but also a security nightmare. A few refugees had already left, but more arrived with wild stories of horror and destruction. Some of the new refugees were silent and passive with dead eyes. Joe was told that these were victims of entropic fields that had partially wiped their minds and memories. They seemed dumb and required special care. Some of them even had to be ordered to eat, but mostly they worked hard without any complaints. Joe was hoping to get more of them. There were several additional official reports from the Alliance and some unofficial ones that didn't sound good. Ungsborn's claim that the Alliance was splintering was confirmed even by the official news. The harbor was mostly empty, and only a few low-ranking Allied officers were keeping watch on the island, possibly just to hold the claim for later. Or maybe they had been forgotten by their superiors. All they had left were a few motorboats. The political situation in the city still resembled powder keg, with the fuse burning quickly. Even Joe was starting to feel rather nervous and moved more and more resources to contingency plans. Then the day came when the fire reached the keg, sooner than expected. Joe was in a clandestine meeting in a small room in the cellar of the town hall with his biggest public enemies.
Joel, my boy, we can't wait any longer,
Grumbled old George Carahorn, the eldest and most conservative councilman of them all. He was almost 90, his face a mask of wrinkles and old scars, but he still ruled his big clan of fishermen and whalers with an iron fist, and a loud voice that he often used to shout at the rest of the council, especially at Joel, while shaking his iron fist. It was literally iron, courtesy of too close encounter with a kraken, when George was still just a captain on one of the many boats of his family. He is right, added Bert Rossfield. He was called the capitalist by the refugees, and even old-timers agreed that the moniker fit him. He was known for pinching pennies until they squealed and begged for mercy. He usually kept silent in council meeting, unless Joe tried to ask for more money for any of the projects that the city needed. I understand that you still hope for a result that won't cause violence and damage to property and lives. I agree with you, Joel, but I think we're past that. Not even if those mercenaries you said you might get show up. I guess you still have no news for them. Joe shook his head. Sadly none, and no serious response from any other group I've managed to contact. That was the truth. His last contact with Wungsborn had been 3 weeks ago when the rest of the Reich's sailors were recalled. Wungsborn had called him on the island on the pretense of saying goodbye. There had been a gray-haired woman who claimed to be an assistant to Admiral Danigsburg, leader of the submarine fleet. Joe had spent about an hour discussing various possibilities with her, but in the end, he was told that any decision had to be made at a conference that the Admiral had planned, and that he would be informed in 2 weeks at most.
This is getting too dangerous for you personally, my boy. You're cutting it too close. I was already asked if I would support a vote against you, possibly for treason. They might even get enough votes. Hell, I would vote against you if I hadn't been this with you from the beginning,
grumbled Carahorn. We've discussed that scenario, said Joel, although he wasn't exactly thrilled about it. That one was a bit too risky.
No, that would be a needless complication, face it. We would need a miracle. A miracle to solve this without any violence. So we declare a state of emergency and the triumvirate. We crack down hard on all those radicals and potential troublemakers you identified, Joel. We have our personal guards, the city guard, my fishermen, near swampies. It should be more than enough.
Barely, objected Rossfield. Even with those mercenaries I've got on my payroll, if you're wrong about some of the families and they decided to fight, it will get bloody. But we need to act now. Any more delays will mean that we'll have to break even more eggs. And I would prefer starting with Argenis and Bunox. Leave the refugees for the second strike.
This is the part I really hate,
complained Kerhorn.
Little Ricky Argeni. I used to take him to sea when he was a wee boy, but there's no helping it. That man is as stubborn and dumb as a brick wall. At least in the Argenis case, we won't have to kill them all. Is your man in place, Joel?
Joel nodded. He had a lot of reliable men and women, including two beings that weren't exactly human, in various places. He was hoping for a miracle, but he was prepared for the worst-case scenario.
Why the hell do they have to be so stupid and blind?
Complained Carol again. The phone on the table started to ring. It had to be something really important, otherwise Joel's secretary wouldn't dare to interrupt this meeting. He picked it up and listened for a moment.
What's happening?
Demanded Carhorn when he saw Joel's face. Joel raised his hand and made a hushing gesture. He listened a bit more.
Set the guards on alert. Contingency plan meta. Don't fight without orders. Same for the ships. I'll be there in a moment.
He said, then he hung up the phone and stared at the other two counselors.
Spit it out. What's going on?
A report from the watchtower on the mountain, Joel said without an emotion. There's a fleet of airships, at least 2,000, approaching the city. And smoke on the horizon, a lot of smoke coming from the surface ships. No answer on the radio.
An invasion?
Yelled Karen.
Who?
The airships have the markings of the Alliance. The councils didn't get far. A group of masked men in fatigues, recognizable by their size and small submachine guns as members of werewolf commander units, emerged out of nowhere and quickly took over the town hall, herding the councillors into a meeting chamber. They were greeted by a gray-haired, elderly-looking woman who explained what was happening. It was the remains of the Alliance, those who no longer had homes they could return to. Military and political leaders, as well as legendary beings and sorcerers, that Joel had always dismissed as propaganda pieces. They called themselves the Founders of new, enlightened age of civilization and progress, and they had chosen Norport as their new home. The annexation was quick, with only a few cases of restrained violence. Even the Boonocks limited themselves to quiet protests. Joe got his bloodless miracle. No matter how hard he looked, he just couldn't find any really good-looking opportunities he could use. The councils would keep their seats for now in a much enlarged representative city council, but any real power ended up in the founders' hands. Resistance seemed futile, but Joe schemed and thought throughout the long proclamation of the new mayor, the gray-haired Megan. He was sure he would be able to find a good angle. A lot of what Megan was spouting sounded like nonsense to Joel. She proclaimed Norport a place where magic would be strictly controlled, essentially forbidden, and as a pledge that the founders would uphold this law, they promised to use their own remaining power to help the city grow. The city had to grow quickly because, with the arrival of the founders, it had doubled in population overnight. Joel felt that this might be a weakness he could use. He felt less sure after he had a short audience with his new ruler.
I'm sorry, Mr. Malachus. There was no time to present you with our counteroffer. You said that your dreams is for Norport to become a beacon of civilization, a big and wealthy city. We're here to do just that. It's up to you if you'll be part of it or not.
And before Joel could say anything, a human-like figure made from wielding darkness presented him with a file.
You might be interested in finding out just how much we know about you, Mr. Malachus,
said a boggy man in a strange voice devoid of any emotion. Joel looked over the first few pages. It looked like all of his misdeeds, both done and planned, were in the file. He didn't bother denying anything.
If it's any consolation, Mr. Malachus, we had been considering Norport as a site for a possible base for some time. It wasn't your attempt to get werewolves as joint forces that drew us here. The Grand Inquisitor had been stationed here for over a year already, said Megan.
Joe waved at the file and asked, "How?"
Mostly magic, Mr. Malachus,
answered the darkness.
Not that showy stuff that one of our colleagues will be using tomorrow to aid the city, but magic nonetheless. Your one weakness is that you disbelieve it. The rest was standard intelligence work. It helped that most of the specialists you recruited lately were my agents.
I repeat, it's up to you what happens now, Mr. Malachus, said the mayor. For a self-proclaimed provincial bumpkin, you're excellent at what you do. I would prefer you in a council seat. Feel free to use your considerable skills against the other councillors and for your personal gain. But if you try any of that shit on us founders, you regret it. Is that understood?
Joel managed to nod. His mind was still numb the next day when he was escorted with the rest of the counselors to witness the start of a new age. He still expected some stupid trick designed to confuse the crowd. The Alliance propaganda contained several stories about an ancient sorcerer, known simply as the Mason, who had helped the Allied forces in several battles by drawing gigantic stone fortifications from the ground with pure magic. However, Joel still couldn't bring himself to believe in something like that. They were standing close to an empty plaza on the edge of the old town that was used for occasional festivals. When the ground started to shake, Joel was sure it must be the mountain, but instead, it was a burly man in an immaculate suit and top hat who slowly raised his hands. And the earth responded. Everyone, not just the Norport old-timers, stared, often slack-jawed, at a giant stone building that was slowly rising from the ground and reaching for the sky. They were later informed that it was a new city hall to house the founders and the new government. It was only a crude stone building, just walls, floors, stairs, and ceilings. Everything else would have to be done by normal labor, but it was a miracle. It made Joel believe in magic.